We can read the list of holy days in Leviticus 23 and understand the sequencing of the spring festivals, the Passover, the first day of unleavened bread, and then later the last day of unleavened bread for the spring. And in preparation for this time, we have meticulously gone through our homes and put out the leaven and the leaven products. And simultaneously, we've examined our lives and to identify things that we do need to overcome. And of course, it's kind of nice to give ourselves credit for what we've already been able to overcome. And we've been checking both physical and our spiritual content of our lives to put out that which shouldn't be there. Well, today I'm going to entitle this particular message, Attention to Details. Attention to Details. Now, in preparation for the New Testament Passover, we usually turn to 1 Corinthians 11:29, and this is a letter from the Apostle Paul to the congregation of the church in the city of Corinth. And Paul is giving instructions as to the proper way to prepare for Passover in the days of unleavened bread. So in 1 Corinthians 11, actually starting in verse 28, he said, "Let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup." Now, in the Phillips translation, it says thoroughly examine. The American Standard Version says prove yourself. If you look at the Common English Bible, it says test. So there's different ways to look at this same verses. Now, of course, we should be doing this every day anyway, because every day we're striving to be the best, to do the best, put out the wrong. Well, many years ago, and I worked for a company called Land O'Lakes. You may be familiar with their dairy products, milk, butter, and ice cream. I worked in the Agricultural Services Division. And it's a Fortune 500 size company. And it's a large cooperative. It operates in at least 9 states. And I worked for the area, in a part of the area in Iowa. And my focus was on livestock nutrition. And it was my job to make sure that all of the local affiliates, that the local feed mills that were manufacturing feed supply for livestock, that they were doing it according to the formula. Because they're selling a formula, there was going to be a benefit to using a particular recipe, you might say. And so from time to time, I would visit each of these feed manufacturing plants and update their records to get the latest version of the latest research that made sure that they were doing what they were doing. And then they had what we call an official feed tag that went on every bag. It was basically like ingredients. If you're looking at something that you're buying at the store, you flip it over and you look at the ingredients as to what is in there. Well, what if those ingredients aren't in there, or maybe there's something in there that shouldn't be? Now you have a legal issue. So my job was to keep them on track, keep them legal, make sure that everything was working the way it was supposed to, because formulations change from time to time. And that changes based on the latest research. Well, state laws, as when there are some federal regulations, require a feed tag, a label attached to every bag. So a label would come out, and you'll see this, whether it's dog food, cat food, or any other livestock, there's going to be a tag or a label on it, and those all have to be up to date. And there's that list of ingredients. And so recognizing what is in there helps people to make decisions and keeps them from going and feeding something they shouldn't. Now, many of you know I have a little hobby farm, and we have a small flock of sheep and a few chickens, a couple dozen chickens. And this, of course, is lambing season. We've had, 8 lambs now in the last 10 days, 2 weeks. But one thing about sheep, and that is if they get too much copper, they will die. So you can't feed cow feed to sheep, because the sheep, if it has copper in it, it will be toxic to them and they will die. And so that's kind of important to have the right combination, and you've got to have the right balance of mixture in the grain. So so you want higher protein like right now I'm feeding grain to the ewes that have just had lambs so they can encourage their milk production. The same thing is with mineral blocks. You have to buy special mineral blocks so that the minerals are not toxic to the sheep. You can't just get the same one for cattle as you can for sheep. And so paying attention to those details can have a big result. It's similar for the few chickens we have. Now, we only have, 20, 30 chickens. But when you have baby chicks, they can't eat the food from the big chickens because it's too big. They can't swallow that. So you got to have the smaller little pieces. And so the bags are all labeled accordingly. This is for one kind of animal. This is for the grown chickens that are laying eggs. This is for the little babies that are just eating in the very small pellets, very high protein, and so forth. And so we can take a look at all of these things as we manage, whether it's our pets or our livestock. And incidentally, by the way, Paul was writing to Corinth saying, test and examine. The city of Corinth historically manufactured copper products. And as I'd mentioned, copper is toxic to sheep, which is interesting because we're often says in the Bible that people are the followers of God are often like a flock, a sheep. So we have to be careful not to take or consume things that are toxic for us, just like the sheep shouldn't consume things that are toxic for them. And of course, the people in Corinth were having a behavior problem that was toxic for them, and Paul was warning them. Well, so we can draw that analogy to our spiritual lives, to the characteristics of the Corinthian congregation. But what about if we all had a label for us? Each one of us had a label as to what we should, what's in us. Is our ingredient list, is it good stuff, or is there anything in there that we really want to get rid of? Anything toxic that's in our label? And I look at Galatians 5:22, and I read about the fruit of the Spirit that's listed, love, joy, peace, and patience, and so forth. And I'm going, well, are there any ingredients in our lives? And that's the benefit of having, a very positive lifestyle. But are there any ingredients where toxicity then could be toxic to others? Maybe we're tolerant of it. So if we look in 2 Corinthians, 13 and verse 5, in 2 Corinthians 13 and verse 5, examine yourselves as to whether you're in the faith. Test yourselves. So there's the words examine, there's the word test. Do you not know yourselves that Jesus Christ is in you unless you are disqualified? So the Apostle Paul is talking to that congregation and saying, let's look inside. Let's look inside to see if there's anything. We might think we're okay, but is there anything there that affects others? Now, you'll notice that verse, it doesn't say, examine your friends and your neighbors and everybody else you know, because we all know that we're very good at that naturally. We can spot other people's hypocrisy through thick walls 2 miles away and point that out upon moment's notice. So that's not the issue. The issue, as Paul was saying, is that let's look on the inside to see what is there that now, and as my youngest brother, who is a comedian in Los Angeles, said, if we really want a detailed list of our faults, all we have to do is ask our spouse. He said, that's for all. That's why we got married, to learn your faults. Well, there was a couple that were de-leavening their home in preparation for the days of unleavened bread, and the wife said that she expected her husband to clean the cars, just to clean the cars in the garage and the stuff outside. She didn't think that was very balanced. And he said, but you take care of the home and I take care of all the other stuff. And she said, well, since you do 90% of the sin, you need to be doing 90% of the cleaning. So I guess they got that organized there. In Galatians 6, starting in verse 3, in Galatians 6, starting in verse 3, for if anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another, for each shall bear his own load. So our responsibility is for ourselves. Now, ultimately, we will stand alone before the judgment of God and that judgment seat, and then as alone, we will have to give account for our lives, for our actions. And fortunately, we do have a defense attorney to stand there with us, an advocate. And I'm very thankful for that because it would be very difficult individually. And someone who can speak up for us, and that, of course, is Jesus Christ, who can stand up and say, I've already paid the penalty for that sin. And so that's kind of important. But if we want to claim that sacrifice of Jesus Christ having paid the penalty, then we annually must renew our commitment, and that's what we do as in what we call the New Testament Passover, to renew that commitment. And in the Passover ceremony, we have the opportunity that is the renewal of a commitment we made when we were baptized. And we can partake of the symbols of the sacrifice of Christ, who died then to cover our sins. Meanwhile, as called upon in Leviticus 23 of the Holy Scriptures, we dutifully set leaven, the symbol of sin, out of our lives for 1 week, and we diligently read the labels on the ingredients to our foods, and we look for types of leaven and unlikely foods by carefully reading the ingredients and discerning which ones are leavening and which ones are not leavening. And I'm sure we all have our own stories where we're surprised to find leaven in a place that we didn't think it would be. But we shouldn't let ourselves become surprised because there are printed labels on almost everything we buy. But in our own lives, we don't have a personal printed label that we can examine to see what's inside of us. We have to dig deep and look in the mirror and look for the real self. Now, it was many years ago. I was in graduate school where I was taking the Introduction to Counseling course, so in preparation to be a state certified counselor. And the professor said something quite memorable. And I want to give you a little background. This particular professor was a very educated man, but he had terribly abused himself for a long time with alcohol and a variety of non-legal drugs. And his marriage had disintegrated. His son was a murderer who killed the professor's grandchildren. In other words, there were bad results that had come from this. The professor then later remarried, and his wife, his second wife, was an accomplished attorney. Unfortunately, she was also an alcohol and drug addict. So he was falling back into that pattern. And then both the professor and then his wife turned their lives around. And they gave up alcohol, they gave up the drugs, and they went on to manage several mental health clinics. They had lived a hard life. And after years of managing those, and with his advanced degrees, he became a professor and teach counseling. And some years later, I was fortunate enough to have him. It was on a Sunday afternoon, and he was stricken with a heart problem on the golf course. And his golfing buddy took him to the emergency room at the hospital. And it was a quirk in circumstance that I happened to be at the hospital on a visit, and I was the first visitor to his bedside, which was completely a fluke, and particularly since how many umpty thousands of people are in the area. And I was there before his wife. I was the first one there who knew him. But from years of alcohol and drug abuse, his arteries had weakened. So his aorta had torn, and it was bleeding, and the tear was against the pumping of the blood. So each time the blood would pump, the tear would get bigger. And so he had to have open heart surgery immediately, which he did. Well, I visited him every day that week at the hospital, He had first open heart surgery, and and life was really touch and go, whether he would actually make it through the first one. And then I had gotten to know this professor during the semester, and I had asked him how he kept motivated on a regular basis to fight the addiction. And he replied that every Monday he had a weekly appointment with his mirror. And my ears perked up because he was explaining that he had to look at himself, examine himself, warts and all, to see himself as he really was. Well, that can be really uncomfortable when you're looking at a mirror and you don't always like what you see. And so he said the regular self-examination was critical to his sense of well-being. He acknowledged and he owned his past of who he was and who then he wished to become. For him, it was a daily and a weekly struggle. The professor was not a church member, yet he had turned his life around to overcome addictions, to put out of his life the things that were not good for him. And his approach was remarkably parallel to what the Holy Scriptures direct us to do, is to regularly test, look, examine, prove ourselves, and look and remove that which is unhelpful. You might say the professor was reading his own ingredients label to see if there was anything in his life every day and every week, if there was anything toxic to his own well-being. And he looked in the mirror for then self-assessment to see himself as he really was. Well, we just a few nights ago, we kept the New Testament Passover, and we read our own personal, in our lives, our own labels, that to see if there's anything toxic within us to get rid of it. We've spent the time now getting rid of the leaven in our lives, and just as the sheep with copper in their diet are going to tip over, it's not going to be good for them. So we can be impacted if there's just a little something that we didn't clean up. So while we are actively doing that for our pets and our livestock, in ourselves, we have to recognize we need to do this all year long on a regular basis, because after 1 week, leaven isn't going to represent sin anymore. It's really a focus right now. But it won't be long that we'll be going back to eating our gooey cinnamon rolls, the bear claws, the frosted and filled donuts, the Ritz crackers, maybe Ezekiel bread, pizza, hamburgers, or other sandwiches. We'll likely stop at the grocery store and we'll purchase some baking soda, baking powder, jars or packets of yeast to put back in our pantry. Once again, we'll have toast with our eggs at breakfast, and some of us will have biscuits and gravy and waffles and pancakes, and maybe partake of ice cream cones, dessert cakes or cookies. I probably missed a few things that you really like, but what about our spiritual lives? What are we going to go back to? Do we model our spiritual lives after our physical lives? Because do we go back to some of the same old things that we were doing before the Passover week, before unleavened bread? So we have to take a look at eating the unleavened products this week as the example of what we need to do throughout the rest of the year. Well, how do we do that? I mean, how do we just avoid going back and relapsing into the sins that we are working to put away? Well, the plan of God for the salvation of mankind has a magnificent way for man to overcome sin. And during the Passover service, then we read in John 15, as we read, that we must stay connected to the vine if we're going to bear fruit. And fruit, as we read in Galatians 5:22, that fruit has a variety of positive benefits, but we've got to be connected to the vine, meaning to our Creator. So once a week, we gather for a weekly Sabbath to worship God, to fellowship with each other, and we bear one another's burdens. We fellowship together, and we avoid our business and work activities so we can focus on godly pursuits. Now, I told you about the old professor who had lived a profligate life, and then he turned his life around. He made a commitment to re-examine his life on a weekly basis. Could we do any less to make a commitment to re-examine our lives regularly? He stressed to me that it wasn't only looking for flaws, he was looking for attributes, things that he did well. In other words, he gave himself credit for things that were helpful so that he could encourage himself with well-doing. He put that into his daily and weekly habits to give himself credit. But then he read his own ingredients label, taking regular inventory. Now, as I recall, at the hospital, when I was checking up on him, and of course I had my university ID badge on at the time, and I was there, and they said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm from the university." And they said, "He won't be teaching class tonight." He was ready to undergo. He had 2 open heart surgeries a few days apart, go in the second time to do that. Really motivated me, but it really struck me as to how committed he was, but he still had to pay the price for the decisions that he had previously made. Just as we have to be careful of the little decisions we made, the attention to the detail, the little ones can have a terribly big price down the road. So we have to be careful. I know that I have to be careful in my own life because I discovered after years of challenges that I was gluten intolerant. So I really want to avoid that because I don't like the 2-day migraines that come out of it, and because it's highly unproductive. And if I make a mistake, the price is very high for even a little mistake. But that's something that becomes obvious to me. What about the mistakes that aren't so obvious to me, but become more obvious to other people? I think we all face those from time to time. And that can happen. Just a tiny decision can have a bad result because I didn't properly read the label or didn't examine that. Well, the same thing is true with our spiritual diet. Do we read the ingredients or the label in our spiritual lives? In Deuteronomy 13 and verse 6, one thing that we have to do when we're looking at our own ingredients in our lives is being careful of the friends we choose. Careful of the friends we choose. In Deuteronomy 13:6, if your brother, the son of your mother, or your son or your daughter, the wife of your bosom, or your friend, who is as your own soul, secretly entices you, saying, "Let us go and serve other gods, which you have not known, neither you nor your fathers, of the gods of the people which are all around you, near to you or far off from you, from one end of the earth to the other end of the earth." It says, in other words, don't let those people entice you that are all surrounded. And where are we? This is the water we swim in. They're all around us. It's easy for us to be enticed. What about the movies we watch or the television shows that we watch? Are we being enticed away from the true God? What about the books or the magazines we read? Are we being enticed away? Are we careful about the words that we use? Not just the negative words. Are we encouraging others with the words that we use? There's many years ago, there was a credit card company, I think it was Capital One, that was advertising and had a catchphrase, "What's in your wallet?" Well, how well do we know ourselves? Not just what's in our wallet, but what's in our ingredient list? Do we have good ingredients that reflect then, that produce the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, and patience, and so forth? Because if we don't have the fruits of the Spirit, what comes in just before Galatians 5:22 is Galatians 5:19. This is some of the most uncomfortable reading in the Bible. in Galatians 5:19, now the works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies, envy, murders, drunkenness, revelness, and the likes of which I tell you beforehand, as I also told you in time past, those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. So that's the verse that came just before the explanation of the fruits of the Spirit. It talks about the works of the flesh. They're putting two different choices there. So people can have an ingredient list that produces the works of the flesh, or they can have ingredients in their lives that produce the fruits of the Spirit. Years ago, there was a fellow that I know, and he was bemoaning finding a Proverbs 31 wife. He was so desired, he said, to find a Proverbs 31 wife with those many attributes, but he had difficulty examining his own ingredients to see if he had the attributes of a Proverbs 31 husband. And he figured that was his biggest challenge, was becoming a Proverbs 31 husband. Another fellow told me that he came really close to having a Proverbs 31 wife, but instead he got a Proverbs 30 wife. I didn't know what he meant. So I went home and I looked up Proverbs 30, and in verse 21 it says, for 3 things the earth is perturbed. Yes, 4 it cannot bear up. For a servant when he reigns, a fool when he's filled with food, and a hateful woman when she's married. Whoa. So I'm going, well, I guess they're trying to get this isolated here. Well, King James uses the word odious instead of hateful. And the Yahoo Online Dictionary defines odious as arousing or deserving hatred or strong dislike or extremely unpleasant. Well, of course, the odious label could be applied to a lot of people in a lot of different ways. But as we conclude the days of, or as we are engaged in the days of unleavened bread, we want to strive to be sure that our personal labels, the ingredient list of our lives, reflect the godly attributes, and that we purge the things that are toxic to us and toxic to others, that are unhelpful. And we look forward then, as we go through these days, getting rid of all that stuff, sort of like cleaning out the closet that really needed to be cleaned, or like we did with the refrigerator this last week, and went on YouTube and saw a couple of videos on really how do you take those shelves apart that those engineers designed that don't seem obvious, and the drawers out, and finally got that one as clean as we could. But we have, and we are refreshed with the knowledge that God has given us, that He's allowed us to respond to His call, to participate in His work, and we can go forward with dignity and enthusiasm. We're thankful now for these days of unleavened bread, and although we won't be looking at the food labels quite the same, we're going to really intensely look at them for this week, but we have to be mindful of the continuing look at ingredients in our lives. So let's be sure that the ingredient labels of our lives are what God wants them to be, because we're going to pay attention to details.